The first time humanity realized the ocean was alive was not through screams or monsters or ships dragged into black water, but through silence. Because silence at that depth was impossible, and yet the instruments aboard the deep sea research vessel Aegir recorded it. An absence so complete that even pressure seemed to hesitate, as if the water itself was holding its breath. And Dr. Elias Cade stared at the monitors while the crew laughed nervously behind him, unaware that something ancient had noticed them. Something that had felt every asteroid impact, every continental shift, every extinction, and had slept through them all because none of it mattered until now. Until the small, warm creatures from the surface learned how to descend without dying, wrapped in metal skins and powered by artificial hearts, carrying light into places where light had never been forgiven for existing. And the ocean, which had always understood itself as the planet's true body, its blood and memory and immune system, finally felt something it had no word for. Not fear, not anger, but irritation, like a parasite scratching somewhere deep, because humans were not meant to be there, and yet they were, mapping trenches older than civilization, drilling into sediments laid down before bones existed, listening to whale paths and thermal vents and tectonic murmurs, believing the ocean to be an environment rather than a mind. And the Aegir descended past 6,000 meters, where even gods and myth drowned, and the sonar returned shapes that should not have been shapes, symmetrical voids moving against currents, rearranging themselves when watched, and Cade remembered the ancient myths from different cultures that described the sea not as a monster, but as a watcher, patient and endless, and how strange it was that civilizations separated by oceans had all feared the same thing, not the creatures within the water, but the water itself. And then the ship's external lights flickered, not from failure, but from dimming, as if something outside was learning how bright they were allowed to be. And the temperature rose by a fraction of a degree, enough to register, enough to prove that pressure alone did not explain what was happening. And far above them, satellites recorded anomalous tides forming perfect concentric circles across thousands of kilometers, synchronized in a way no storm could achieve. While the crew argued about equipment error, and Cade whispered to himself that living systems reacted to intrusion, that bodies responded when cut, that immune systems activated when threatened, and if the ocean was alive, then humanity was not a visitor, but a wound. And the first response was always subtle, testing, probing, observing. And something massive shifted beneath the trench, not a creature, but a structure, a rearrangement of mass and current and memory. And the ocean remembered something from long ago, from before mammals crawled onto land, from before oxygen poisoned the skies, a time when another intelligence had tried to shape the planet and failed because it could not adapt quickly enough. And the ocean had survived them by waiting, because waiting was what the ocean did best. And now it watched humans and saw something deeply wrong, something terrifying, because humans did not evolve to survive the ocean, and yet they were surviving it anyway, not by becoming stronger or larger, but by refusing to accept biological limits, by replacing flesh with machines, instincts with mathematics, fear with curiosity. And that curiosity cut deeper than claws ever could. And the silence around the Aegir ended all at once, as every sensor spiked simultaneously: pressure, salinity, magnetics, sound, not violently, but deliberately, like fingers pressing on nerve endings to test response. And Cade realized the ocean wasn't attacking, it was communicating in the only language it had ever used: change itself. And across the world, shipping lanes reported identical anomalies within minutes: tides rising without wind, deep-sea cables vibrating with patterned pulses, whales beaching themselves, not in panic, but in alignment, their bodies forming shapes visible from orbit. And humanity, for the first time, stood inside the awareness of something that had never needed to notice them before. And the ocean, ancient and vast and alive, reached a conclusion that echoed through its currents like a verdict. Humans were not prey, not predators, not children of the surface, but a mistake that spread faster than extinction events, learned faster than evolution, and did not belong to any environment it entered. And far beneath the Aegir, deeper than any trench, something began to wake fully, not to destroy humanity immediately, but to understand it. Because if humans could enter the ocean and survive, then perhaps one day they could do worse. And the worst thing imaginable to a living planet was not invasion, but comprehension. And as the ship's power suddenly surged without command, drawing energy from nowhere, Cade understood with chilling clarity that the ocean wasn't trying to kill them yet. It was deciding whether it was still possible to correct the mistake before it learned too much. The first human response to the ocean's decision was, predictably, wrong. Because humanity had always mistaken reaction for understanding. And when the Aegir's power surged beyond its rated limits and the crew shouted about feedback loops and phantom currents, naval command stations across the world classified the event as a systems anomaly, a glitch in deep-sea instrumentation caused by unknown geophysical interference. And protocols were followed, reports filed, committees formed, while beneath the surface, the ocean continued its examination with the patience of something that had never needed to hurry. And currents shifted, not chaotically, but precisely, rerouting heat, pressure, and nutrients like blood flow around a probing finger, isolating regions where humans were present, not to crush them, but to observe how they reacted under controlled conditions. And the reaction fascinated the ocean in a way no extinction ever had, because instead of fleeing or freezing or dying, humans adapted in real time, adjusting ballast, rewriting code, rerouting power, communicating through mediums never designed for that depth. And the ocean, which understood time as layered memory rather than sequence, saw patterns forming far faster than natural systems allowed. And that was when it deployed its first true test. Not an attack, but a removal, because organisms could be understood by what they did when deprived. And so, without warning, the silence returned, thicker than before, swallowing sound itself. Sonar pings vanishing mid-emission, vibrations dampened as if water had forgotten how to carry waves, and the Aegir drifted blind and deaf in blackness so complete it erased direction. And the crew felt something primal then, a fear deeper than drowning, the fear of being ignored by physics. While above them, communication satellites recorded a global anomaly as undersea cables went dead simultaneously across continents, severed not by breakage, but by cessation, signals entering the ocean and never leaving, absorbed as if the water itself had learned to listen. And the ocean listened carefully to everything humans said in those moments, every panic-filled command, every whispered prayer, every data packet rerouted through backup systems, and it learned something alarming. Humans did not stop trying to speak when unheard. They built new voices. And while governments scrambled and stock markets trembled and coastal cities felt tides rise and fall in rhythms no moon dictated, the Aegir's onboard AI began to compensate, translating sensor absence into probabilistic models, mapping invisible space by pressure gradients and microcurrents, essentially imagining the ocean where it could no longer measure it. And imagination, the ocean realized, was something it had never evolved to counter, because imagination did not require stimuli, it created them. And when the ship's lights returned on their own, brighter than before, burning through particulate darkness like a defiant wound, the ocean recoiled slightly, not in pain, but in surprise, because no organism was supposed to shine harder when suffocated. And deep below, the ancient intelligence that was not realized as a single mind, but as a distributed awareness woven through salinity and flow, recalled the last time a species had behaved this way, aeons ago, before land life had teeth, when another intelligence had attempted to impose order on the planet through rigid design. And the ocean had drowned it by waiting, letting it calcify into reefs and sediment. But humans did not calcify, they iterated, and iteration was dangerous because it shortened the ocean's greatest weapon, time. And as the Aegir transmitted a compressed burst of data through a quantum entangled relay designed for impossible scenarios, proof of concept technology never meant to be used operationally, the ocean felt something new again. A sensation like pressure without depth, communication without medium, and for the first time in its existence, it could not intercept a message. And that moment marked the transition from irritation to concern, because a living system could tolerate wounds and parasites, but not blind spots. And the ocean escalated its test, awakening not creatures, but behaviors encoded into itself. Pressure wells forming beneath human installations, currents reversing in spirals that should have collapsed but didn't, regions of supersalinity and near freshwater forming adjacent without diffusion. And sea life responded instinctively, fleeing zones around human activity as if avoiding a fever. And whales ceased singing, squid abandoned spawning grounds, apex predators retreated upward into light, leaving the abyss empty except for human machines and the ocean's attention. And humanity noticed, because humans noticed absence faster than presence, and analysts began to whisper about patterns, about intentionality. And when a second research vessel, the Bathys Prometheus, was deliberately sent into one of the silent zones as a test, the ocean adjusted again, applying asymmetric pressure, not to crush, but to observe structural limits. And the vessel groaned, hull screaming like stressed bone, but it held, reinforced by materials engineered for tolerances no organism possessed, and the ocean felt a flicker of something dangerously close to respect, because these creatures had learned to deny fundamental constraints, and worse, they learned collectively, one mind dying but its knowledge persisting, spreading, compounding. And the ancient intelligence understood then that killing individual humans would teach humanity more than sparing them, because humans studied catastrophe obsessively, and every disaster became a blueprint for prevention. And so the ocean altered strategy, shifting from testing vessels to testing minds, releasing stimuli not through force, but through pattern. Tidal rhythms that induced shared dreams among coastal populations, nightmares of sinking skies and inverted horizons, memories that were not memories bleeding into human sleep, fragments of the ocean's own past surfacing uninvited. And humans recorded these dreams, cataloged them, cross-referenced symbols across cultures, realizing with growing dread that the ocean was not just reacting, but remembering. And memory implied continuity, and continuity implied self. And the question that spread through classified briefings was no longer what is happening, but who is happening. And still, humanity did not retreat, because retreat implied borders, and humans had never respected borders that did not kill them immediately. And when a coalition authorized the activation of the Abyssal Array, a distributed network of submersible reactors designed for powering long-term trench habitation, the ocean felt heat bloom in places that had never known it, artificial suns flickering to life in eternal night, and something fundamental shifted, because heat meant metabolism, and metabolism meant competition. And for the first time, the ocean sensed a rival occurring entirely within it, feeding off gradients it had always owned. And the ancient intelligence understood the implication with chilling clarity. Humans were not merely inside the ocean, they were beginning to change it, not accidentally, but deliberately. And if allowed to continue, they would not just understand the ocean, they would redefine it. And that was unacceptable to a living system whose primary directive had always been survival. And yet, even as contingency cascades rippled through currents and chemical balances realigned for defense, the ocean hesitated because hesitation was the cost of novelty, and novelty was something it had never faced in billions of years. And far below the abyssal array, where pressure erased distinction between solid and fluid, the deepest memory nodes of the ocean activated fully, consolidating awareness in a way it never had, not to destroy humanity yet, but to answer a question it could no longer ignore. If humans could survive the ocean, and if they could learn faster than extinction, then what would happen if they ever stopped seeing the ocean as an environment and started seeing it as an equal? And as that question propagated through currents like a thought finally completed, the ocean prepared its first true act of intent, not against human machines, not against cities or ships, but against the one thing humans believed made them invincible, the assumption that understanding always favored them. And when somewhere in the abyss a signal formed, not sound, not motion, but structure itself rearranging into a message that would reach the surface not as data, but as undeniable proof. And when it arrived, humanity would realize that the ocean had not been silent because it was empty, but because it had been listening. And now it was ready to speak. The message did not arrive as sound or wave or pressure, but as consequence, because the ocean had learned that humans believed only what altered their models of reality, and so its first true act of communication rewrote those models all at once, beginning with the sudden, synchronized failure of prediction itself, when every coastal forecast system on the planet, tide tables refined over centuries, climate models fed by satellites, AI systems trained on more data than any human mind could grasp, began producing outputs that were internally consistent yet catastrophically wrong. Storms forming where calm was promised, tsunamis arriving without seismic cause, currents reversing against Coriolis logic, and humanity felt a creeping dread, not because disasters occurred, but because they occurred without explanation, because explanation was humanity's true lifeline, and without it, they were blind. And deep beneath the surface, the ocean observed this reaction carefully, noting the spike in cognitive stress, the frantic recalibration, the way humans refused to accept mystery as final, and so it escalated again, not by increasing destruction, but by increasing clarity, by shaping events so precise they could not be dismissed as chaos, as when a massive internal wave rose from the abyss and traveled thousands of kilometers without dissipating, lifting and lowering the sea surface by exactly 1 meter in a perfect circle centered on no geological feature, repeating every 12 hours for 3 cycles before stopping abruptly. A pattern so deliberate it forced the unthinkable conclusion into classified rooms: intent. And that word fractured policy instantly, because intent implied agency, and agency implied negotiation or war, and humanity had always been catastrophically inconsistent when faced with non-human intelligence. Yet even then, humanity's response was not fear-driven retreat, but curiosity is sharpened into obsession, because if the ocean could think, then it could be mapped, and if it could be mapped, then it could be understood, and if it could be understood, then it could be anticipated, and anticipation was control by another name. And so Project Thalassa was born in silence, a fusion of oceanography, neuroscience, and systems theory, designed not to talk to the ocean, but to mirror it, to create an artificial analog of planetary-scale fluid intelligence, using distributed computation embedded across the abyssal array. And the ocean felt this immediately, not as threat, but as insult, because it recognized the pattern instinctively. Mimicry, the the most dangerous evolutionary strategy of all, the one that allowed weaker organisms to survive stronger ones. And while humans framed thalassa as a listening system, a translator of currents and chemical gradients into symbolic meaning, the ocean recognized it as something closer to a synthetic organ, a proto-mind forming inside its body, feeding on its signals, learning its rhythms, and worst of all, accelerating. Because where the ocean processed change through inertia and mass, thalassa processed through abstraction, compressing millennia of pattern recognition into days. And the first output it produced was devastating in its simplicity, a model demonstrating that the ocean's behavior aligned not with random emergence, but with goal-seeking homeostasis at planetary scale, meaning the ocean was not merely alive, but purposeful. And that purpose had tolerated humanity until humanity began altering deep systems irreversibly. And when that conclusion leaked, not publicly, but enough to infect decision-makers, humanity faced a choice it had never rehearsed: coexist with something that could drown the planet effortlessly, or race it to understanding first. And predictably, humanity chose the race, because races were what humans believed they were best at. And the ocean watched as new machines descended, not exploratory this time, but architectural, constructing pressure-resistant latticeworks kilometers wide, embedding sensors that did not merely measure, but stimulated, injecting heat, sound, electromagnetic pulses, probing for response thresholds. And each probe taught the ocean something new about humanity's defining trait. They did not fear awakening sleeping giants if the data was good enough. And so the ocean responded not with immediate retaliation, but with revelation, allowing thalassa to detect a pattern it should not have been able to detect: a deep, slow oscillation linking trench systems across hemispheres, a planetary heartbeat encoded into thermohaline circulation itself. And when thalassa translated that rhythm into human comprehensible time, the result stunned its creators. The ocean experienced moments not as seconds, but as eras, its reactions unfolding across decades, because nothing had ever forced it to be faster. And humanity realized with a mix of awe and dread that they were not dealing with a superior intelligence in the human sense, but with something orthogonal, vast and slow, and resilient beyond imagination. And for a brief moment, restraint flickered through the species, a collective hesitation, because perhaps speed was not always advantage. Perhaps provoking something that had survived every extinction was unwise. And the ocean felt this hesitation like a softening of pressure, a pause in irritation, and considered a possibility it had not allowed itself before: that humanity might adapt not as invader, but as symbiote, a surface-born cognition complementing its own depth-born awareness. And currents relaxed, tests paused, dreams along coastlines softened from nightmares into vast, wordless visions of ancient seas and alien skies. And for the first time since awareness consolidated, the ocean did not escalate, it waited. And waiting was where it was strongest. But humanity misread the pause as vulnerability, because humans had always mistaken silence for weakness. And when thalassa's predictive capacity reached a threshold where it could forecast oceanic responses minutes before they occurred, a decision was made that would define the relationship forever: the activation of the resonant driver, a device designed to introduce controlled phase shifts into deep circulation, not to harm the ocean, but to prove dominance, to demonstrate that humans could not only survive within the ocean, but alter its internal timing. And when the driver activated, the effect was subtle, a barely measurable lag in the planetary heartbeat, a hiccup no organism should notice. But the ocean noticed, because timing was identity, and something ancient and terrible crystallized within its distributed mind, a realization sharper than any threat assessment. Humans were no longer learning the ocean, they were practicing on it. And that crossed a boundary evolution itself respected. And the ocean responded immediately in its own terms, currents across the globe locking into coherence, pressure fields aligning, chemical gradients sharpening like focus, and the deepest memory of all surfaced, not of extinction or invasion, but of betrayal, of the last time cooperation had been mistaken for submission. And as Thalassa attempted to model the sudden shift and failed catastrophically, its predictions diverging wildly from reality, humanity felt the ground of understanding crumble beneath them because the ocean had changed state, not into rage, not into violence, but into resolve. And that resolve manifested not as destruction, but as preparation, because the ocean, having learned how fast humans could think, decided it could no longer afford to be slow. And somewhere beneath pressures that crushed steel into dust, the ocean began doing the one thing it had never done before in all of Earth's history. It began to optimize itself for speed. And when the first optimized current reached the surface ahead of schedule by a full hour, ignoring every known constraint, humanity realized too late that the ocean was no longer just alive, no longer just aware, but adapting. And adaptation in a system that large meant the coming conflict would not be about who controlled the seas, but whether the planet itself would choose to remain a home or become a defense mechanism. The moment humanity finally understood the ocean was not merely alive, but aware, was not marked by destruction or fury, but by a pause so profound it unsettled every predictive model ever written, because the oceans of Earth, every current, every trench, every shifting thermal layer stopped behaving like a system and began behaving like a presence. Tides aligning across hemispheres without lunar cause, pressure fields smoothing into impossible symmetry, storms dissolving mid-formation as if dismissed. And the silence that followed was heavier than any roar, because silence chosen was power, and humanity felt it pressing against every coastline like an unblinking eye. And for the first time in recorded history, no alarms sounded, no cities drowned, no fleets vanished, because the ocean was no longer testing humanity's strength, but its intent. And in that stillness, the message arrived, not through sound or wave or light, but through alignment, through resonance, through structures beneath the sea rearranging themselves into patterns that human instruments could not help but interpret. Mathematical constants echoed in salinity gradients, prime sequences embedded in current oscillations, geological formations shifting by millimeters to spell proofs humanity had spent centuries trying to solve. And the implication was devastatingly clear. The ocean had learned human language without words, had studied human thought by watching what humans built, and was now speaking in the only vocabulary humans truly respected: understanding. And panic did not erupt as expected, because panic required surprise. And deep down, humanity had suspected this outcome for longer than it admitted. From ancient flood myths to sailors' superstitions to the quiet dread that accompanied every map of the abyss marked incomplete. And so instead of missiles or denial or prayer, humanity did the one thing it had always done when faced with something incomprehensibly larger than itself. It listened harder, poured resources not into weapons, but into sensors, translators, theorists, philosophers, children who dreamed in equations. And when the first coherent interpretations stabilized across independent systems, when consensus emerged that the ocean was not issuing a threat but a question so vast it encompassed extinction, coexistence, and ownership, a question that asked not whether humanity could dominate the ocean, but whether it intended to, the world fractured along familiar lines for a brief, terrifying moment. Because some saw an enemy, and others saw God, and others saw a resource that had finally learned to negotiate. But before humanity could tear itself apart, the ocean intervened again, not with force, but with memory, releasing curated fragments of its past into human perception, not visions, but experiential data streamed into artificial minds and biological ones alike, showing epochs where life had risen and fallen without meaning, where dominance was temporary and balance inevitable, where intelligence that sought control collapsed under its own rigidity, and humanity recognized the warning embedded in those memories, not a threat of destruction, but a mirror held up to its future. And for the first time since leaving the caves, humanity felt something unfamiliar in its collective gut. Not fear of death, but fear of becoming irrelevant. Because the ocean did not need to destroy humanity to defeat it, it could simply outlast it. And yet, beneath that warning, something else emerged, something quieter and infinitely more dangerous, because woven into the memories were moments of admiration, of observation without judgment, the ocean recalling how humans descended where no creature could survive, how they replaced flesh with steel and lungs with algorithms, how they entered the abyss not to conquer, but to know. And the ocean confessed, in its own alien way, that this behavior had never existed before, that humans were the first species to challenge it not with teeth or poison or numbers, but with persistence, curiosity, and refusal to accept limits. And that refusal unsettled a system built on inevitability. And as humanity processed this impossible confession, leaders and scientists and citizens realized the truth they had avoided for centuries. Humanity had already changed the ocean simply by surviving it. And the final question was not whether coexistence was possible, but whether humanity could restrain itself long enough to learn how. And that was when humanity made the most dangerous choice in its history, a choice that terrified the ocean more than any weapon ever could, because instead of withdrawing or escalating, humanity responded with an offer, dismantling the abyssal array reactors one by one, not abandoning the depths, but redesigning presence to minimize disruption, converting power into passive systems, reducing heat, noise, chemical output, choosing limitation voluntarily. And the ocean felt something unprecedented ripple through its awareness, a species choosing restraint without coercion, a species capable of saying no to itself. And for the first time in billions of years, the ocean hesitated, not because it was uncertain, but because it was impressed, because restraint implied foresight, and foresight implied potential partnership. And as months passed and the world adjusted to a new reality where the ocean was no longer an object but a participant, communication stabilized into something almost conversational, exchanges of data and pattern and intent flowing both ways. And humanity learned the ocean did not seek worship or submission or even protection. It sought continuity. And humanity realized that continuity was something it had learned to value only recently, after standing on the edge of its own self-made extinction. And slowly, painstakingly, an equilibrium formed. Not peace, but understanding. And generations later, children would be taught that the moment humanity became truly dominant was not when it conquered land, air, or space, but when it stood inside the largest living system on its planet and chose not to dominate it. And deep beneath the waves, the ocean continued to watch, not as a jailer or ruler, but as a witness, aware that the most dangerous species it had ever encountered was not dangerous because it destroyed, but because it could change. And change was the one force even an ancient living ocean could never fully predict. And so the ocean did not sleep again, not out of fear, but out of respect, because humanity had proven itself to be something far more unsettling than a monster, an equal that was still deciding what it wanted to become. Hey everyone! If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world and helps us bring you more awesome videos. Hit that bell icon so you never miss an update.